Right, so avant-garde or experimental film in cinema, for me, is those filmmakers, first of all, who are working outside the mainstream commercial system, and also the independent, or what we call off-Hollywood system, where films can still get funded up front and then they make their movie. These are all filmmakers working often with no money to start with, making their films because of the passion they have. So they're really outside of the kind of mainstream ways that films are created and then shown. Also, I think these filmmakers are focusing very much on the structure. They're very conscious of narrative structure, how to create a story, but also how to subvert the story and play with the images and time and space. Very different from the constraints of most all commercial cinema, which very much falls into the, like boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl in the end. So, and then there's a third level I've come to understand in recent years that I think globally, there are certain artists that are working almost by choice outside of what the national production systems may be. So in America, I just described the situation. And in Greece, I'm sure maybe there's a main sort of production entities that fund films, and there are people who maybe don't have access to that, who are making works on the side. So in part, it's a way to say, we want to express our creative vision, regardless of what the dominant production system or funding system, or like in Paris or in France, the government, the CNC can fund a lot of work, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of experimental or avant-garde artists making their films and putting them in co-ops or showing them in museums. This program is called A Panorama of American Experimental Narratives in the New Millennium. So it's a retrospective, and most people think of retrospectives as something very old, but this is a retrospective of films from 1999 to 2014 of these avant-garde artists. So I'm not a filmmaker, I'm a curator, and so I thought a lot about how are the filmmakers of today making work that maybe differed from years ago. And very briefly, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, most of these filmmakers, in distinction, let's say, to the 60s, where there were a lot of short films made by Stan Brakhage and people like that, are making feature-length works. So already it becomes a shift from an abstract style or avant-garde techniques of showing the sprockets in the film or the scratched leader to dealing with the length of the film. It's about narrative construction. So that's one thing that I wanted to bring out, is that the filmmakers are more concerned with, let's say, how to construct their story and how to deconstruct it than uniquely about the technique. And then the other thing is that the filmmakers are all dealing on some level, because often it's just one person making the movie, or it's one person's vision rather than a whole studio production system. So these films are about identity, individual identity, family identity, community identity, or some kind of political or governmental one. So all the films in the program on one level or another, whether they're animation films, found footage films, or live action films, or a combination, are really all about that. Well, I think the biggest obstacle in making a good experimental movie nowadays is the lack of knowledge about the history and tradition of experimental filmmaking. Just because digital equipment is more accessible, just because the YouTube is more accessible, doesn't mean that just because somebody has an idea and they want to make a movie, that makes it good. So I think, and what I always recommend, is people understand what came before. This is what I've always done in my career. And it's not to go back to some old ways of making things, but it's to understand the tradition. So when one's making a film on a certain subject or a certain technique, there's a knowledge of what came before, so one can say, yes, I understand this, but I want to go in that kind of direction. So that's what I think the biggest obstacle is, the lack of historical knowledge. So for me, what's very important, not as a filmmaker, is that I think a lot about all different kinds of films that I see, commercial films, early cinema, recent films, and I do a lot of work with experimental film. So when I'm looking, because I'm not a filmmaker, I'm looking for like connections between works, and I feel when certain ideas come to me that I want to present those programs and put them together. So that's like what happened at this festival, the Athens Avant-Garde Film Festival. When I worked at the Tribeca Film Festival, I was kind of outside of the main structure because I worked as a consultant. So I just focused on experimental films, and that gave me the freedom to think mostly about the films and how they spoke to the human condition and how they spoke to me, and how to put them together, short films into programs that had an emotional reaction from the audience, how they were structured together, rather than be focused in a lot of, you know, administrative matters that a lot of festivals and museums and universities now seem to be filled with. So it gives me the freedom to kind of have my vision and try to present it. The challenge always is that if you're in an institution, sometimes like a museum, you can, you know, if you're in it, it's sometimes easier to make the things happen, although maybe not so much anymore today. And sometimes outside, it's more of a challenge to find where is the avenue to show it. But like with this program, Maria heard about it, Komninos, and she said, I want to do this because it fits very well. So I feel like I have a confidence that people who understand what I'm doing will come to show and appreciate the work and make it happen.